Hello, my name is Samuel Abelo. I'm a multimedia artist living in the United States. And in this video, I'm discussing with German theological student Johannes, my friend, about tradition and why it's as important today as ever before. There's reference to Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who was a great writer and had amazing ideas, insightful ideas about consumerism and humanism from a Jewish perspective. Additionally, I mentioned the psychologist C.G. Jung, who built off the ideas of Nietzsche. And this is because Jung had remarkable insights into the most poignant questions of today, including relationship, marriage, and sexuality. I thought you might find it interesting that Rabbi Jonathan Sacks makes a similar argument that I think, as far as I understand, you're trying to make that. Well, he makes a very strong argument that humanism, which becomes in collaboration with consumerism in our present culture, is not a sufficient way of life. It's not a sufficient set of principles. And he backs this up with data about, suicide and depression and happiness, that it preaches happiness, but in fact people are less happy, and that this is an argument for why we need traditions. So he talks about how humanism says value yourself and your individuality, while tradition says serve something greater than you. Consumerism says acquire things, and tradition says be helpful to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Give. So they're actually inverses of one another. And he says that because humanism comes out of, this is his view, that it's a Jewish view, that he actually says his favorite anti-Semite, he's making a joke, is Nietzsche, because Nietzsche recognized that the Jews produced Christianity and Christianity produced science and humanism. He says that humanism is an extension of certain aspects of Judaic values, like the individual. So it's not that we need to do away with humanism, but we need tradition and those traditional values as well. So I was wondering if you would comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think it's kind of like misattribution. You're misusing humanism as a guide to how to live your life, where it's supposed to be more theoretical. Humanism is about, what humanism should be about is valuing human life properly within ethics and within your value system. What it's not about is telling you how to be happy, because humanism will tell you that looking at yourself and doing things for yourself, basically being, if not egoistic, then at least still immanent with your desires, will make you happy. Serving other people will make you happy, or being served by other people will make you happy. And that doesn't really work. It never transcends the earthly base. It gets shallow. And it's the exact opposite of what tradition teaches, because tradition teaches that trying to make your own happiness will make you unhappy, because you're working for yourself. What will make you happy is not doing that, is not taking yourself as coming from yourself, and therefore, if you take yourself to be brought forth by yourself, basically, then you have to make your own life. Very fundamentally, you have to build it up from the ground. And that's impossible. You can't make ground.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And in exactly the same way, it's the exact same way with consumerism. Consumerism is about taking. the Western society is quite consumptive from the ground up. It consumes a lot of ground. It's expanding. America is founded on the principle of manifest destiny. You manifest ever more destiny as you frontier to the West. Until that stopped, and now it's kind of turned global and
Manifested on social media.
it's manifesting on social media, and it's not working.
It makes people miserable, yeah.
Yeah. And what's so funny is that it keeps being proposed as a solution to itself, and it can't ever be. No matter how much you acquire, you will never.
The only thing that I want to like push back on, I guess, is that like I think that Jung was a genius beyond Kant, beyond Goethe, and beyond Nietzsche. That's why his personality encapsulates all of them. His works do. He has a larger personality, and his works are larger than them. Now, most people can't even contact Jung because it's too massive. But his because he was so great, his impact has affected the culture. It's not the dominant consumerism, but what we have countering it is New Ageism, which is a magical self-development. So you're not serving yourself, you're trying to grapple with how you serve other people and how you deal with your complexes or your shadow. And it's so infused with Jungianism, I would say. And I see that as an attempt to create traditions. There's a contemporary psychologist named Esther Perelman who talks about habits versus traditions, and traditions are something creative and that has meaning. And even the word meaning is such a Jungianism. And people always send me things that either connected loosely with New Age retreats or New Age self-development. Part of what I'm saying is Jung's premise is that like as you said, we can't create ground. Like there is a ground, and whether or not we want to deal with it or not, it's there. You can disassociate into like pure intellectualism, but that doesn't change the fact that you're a human being in a body. You know what I'm saying? So what tradition will become, what new traditions will arise, that's very much in flux right now. That's the best I can say. But I believe that the concept of the mitzvot, those are unchanging. And for a Jew, there's 613, but for the people of the world, there's 7. And they're very basic, like they're very essential, and they're very psychological. Most of them emphasize that thou shalt not worship anything besides the one. That's a very abstract concept. And what that means is like you don't worship consumerism. You don't become a communism person. You don't identify with these fleeting trends. You try to center your personality towards like a sort of wholeness, a oneness, and deal with the many that comes along with your intellect, with your reason. These are Jewish concepts that that are timeless and relevant today. Tradition is something that like naturally does evolve and change, even with the Jews who are so ultra conservative, right? In at least the ones who are observant. What I'm challenging you on is like, what traditions specifically do you see being necessary or helpful to people today? Is it marriage and marriage rights? Is it is it actually like going to a sacred place on a certain day of the week? Is it prayer times? Those are the questions that I would be interested in hearing you at least like speculate or contemplate.
Yeah, I think it's more abstract than that, at least in part. I think abstractly speaking, traditionality itself is needed. And it can be filled in different ways.
Okay.
But there are different traditions, and there are many different traditions for a reason. Um, and the interplay between traditions is also where a lot of beauty comes from. And then you just have to see, every individual has to see how they fit into the landscape of traditions.
Okay.
And
So it's very psychological. You're not denying individual psychological work, but you're emphasizing the need for community,
I'm
for shared, let's say.
um, for unchangingness over a long period of time, like multiple generations. You have to look
Okay.
at we have to look at a longer time span than we are used to do in our modern age. And then there are, of course, traditions which I think are important to society at large. But also not in every case. So I don't think there are any traditions that have to be implemented by rule of law,
Like dogma.
like dogma. But there are certainly traditions that would be helpful to society if a lot of people adopt them, like marriage, for example. I do think that for more people than are willing to admit it in our day and age, the monogamous relationship and marriage, especially, are the best possible relationships.
But you wouldn't go as far as saying that contraceptives shouldn't be used and that people should have children right away.
I No, I wouldn't go as far as that.
See, I don't mean to actually like put you on the spot there, but I'm saying like those are actually the questions that I think are the answers that tradition gives.
I think it's worth thinking about. I do think the link between marriage and having children should be thought about more deeply.
Yes, I purposefully emphasized it partially because there's a quote in Jung, volume 9.1, which I think is, again, a person whose comprehension leads to rational, empirical statements that are proof with the test of time. He says that the emphasis on the intellect and reason will only produce a resurgence of identification with the goddess. And one aspect of the goddess is sex for pleasure. And one that same psychologist I mentioned who emphasizes traditions, who is a Jewess, married to a Jew, but they're secular, very secular. What does she say? She says that female sexuality is essentially narcissistic. It's an identification with instinctuality. Feminine instinctuality is what is caused by the intellect, is a reaction to intellectualism. Well, all I'm trying to say is that what I'm trying to say there is that in this current state of affairs where the rationalism is so prominent, and then on the counter side is the identification with the goddess is so prominent, everything's going to be very much in flux, and a decision about what traditions are valuable are going to be very fraught over. And the reason I emphasize the 7 Noahide laws is that if we can disidentify from components of personality, which include the maternal instinct, the goddess, which we just mentioned, rationalism, which is extension of reason. It's like the inflation of reason to an ultimate ideal. We want to have reason.
What exactly do you mean by rationalism?
Sam Harris, like everything is like a component of the brain, and we're just sort of like a bag of hamburger meat.
Okay. So that type of rationalism.
Yeah, rationalism like that. We want reason and we want to be in touch with our instincts, but all of these are components of a personality. But by emphasizing the wholeness, the oneness of potential personality, then we get outside of those identifications, which means like unconsciously being one dimension to a fault. That's what identification causes. We have a more we that's what leads to the type of thing that you're emphasizing, which is honest conversations, honest investigation about the consequences of these various components of life, because that's what they are. They're components. And yes.
Yeah, and what's interesting now, let's talk about tradition in relationship to relationships. Because you can either have a traditional relationship or you can have a non-traditional relationship, is what people think. But that's not true, because there isn't traditional. The traditional doesn't exist. There's a multitude of traditions, but there's only one type of not being traditional, which is what you see all around you. It's all the same. Everybody's the same in their indifferent non-tradition, and in different uniqueness, you could say. But if you see yourself as playing with traditions, being in play with traditions, together with another person, you're going to have a much more fulfilled, rounded out relationship, because you have a lot of form to play with.